Greetings and welcome to episode 15 of Bible 180. 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation, 10 to 15 minutes at a time. And we're on Genesis 18 and 19, the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the last episode, we went from 15 and Eliezer of Damascus to the birth of Ishmael with Hagar. In chapter 21, we're going to look at chapters 18 and 19 today. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, often we think of the fire falling from the heavens and destroying those cities in a single moment. We picture smoke rising from a furnace, and we remember Lot's wife who looked back and became a pillar of salt. But the story is really more than just a headline about judgment. It's a mirror. Genesis 18 and 19 is a mirror into the heart of God, into the condition of a culture, and into the mercy that still reaches into broken places. So today there are three truths about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. One, it talks about the seriousness of sin. Two, it talks about the patience and mercy of God. And three, it calls for righteous living in a corrupted world. First of all, it talks about the seriousness of sin. In Genesis 18, the Lord says to Abraham, remember in 12 to 25, there are 6 conversations between God and Abraham. In Genesis 18, God says to Abraham that the outcry comes from Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, the sin is so great and not hidden. It was loud, it cried out, and God said, I am going to destroy it. Now, sometimes in Christian tradition, we're taught that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was homosexuality. There are a bunch of gay guys doing all kinds of stuff there in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not that simple. It's not even that biblically correct, because if you look at the text, what it says, for instance, in Ezekiel 16:49, God said the guilt of Sodom and Gomorrah was pride, it was excess, it was promiscuity, it was prosperous ease, it was neglect of the poor and needy. There was arrogance, and there was injustice, and there was violence. There was a complete disregard for God and God's people who had been made in God's image. Sometimes, in order to be anti those who are gay, people say and think, well, my denomination, whatever it is, teaches me that Sodom and Gomorrah, the main sin was homosexuality. Not quite so simple. It was promiscuity. It was pedophilia. Pedophilia was rampant in those times, especially against young boys and young girls, by older men, to show violence, to show control, to show satisfaction for their desires. Not simple homosexuality, but a whole lot of stuff. Pedophilia was the main sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with pride and excess, promiscuity, prosperous ease, neglect of the poor and needy. It was a society that had been became comfortable in sin. They were proud of their rebellion. They were cruel to the vulnerable, and they rejected righteousness. So to simplify it as a story against homosexuality is simply not in the story. The moral decay of Sodom and Gomorrah was not subtle. The culture had become aggressive and evil. Sin was no longer private. It was celebrated and defended. So when wrong feels right, when conviction turns into mockery, when righteousness seems non-existent, then it shows that God says, I'm not going to ignore this wickedness forever. God's justice may be delayed, but God's justice is never absent. So before the fire fell on Sodom and Gomorrah, something amazing happened. God says in chapter 18, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham comes to God. God told Abraham, I'm going to destroy the whole place. Abraham came to God and said, will you indeed sweep away all the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you sweep them away from the place and not forgive it for the sake of 50 righteous who are in there? And then, I love how Abraham says, he says to God, far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you, he repeats. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, okay. If I find 50 righteous in a city, I'll forgive the whole place for their sake. Abraham said, let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord, for I am who I am, but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the righteous of the 50 are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for the lack of 5? And God says, okay, I won't destroy it if I find 45 righteous people there. And then Abraham spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found righteous. God said, well, for the sake of 40, I won't do it. Then he said, oh, my Lord, don't be angry. Suppose 30 are found there. And he said, okay, I won't do it for 30. He whittles God down to 10. He starts at 50, goes down to 10. And God said, okay, for 10, I won't do it. God visits a city. Nothing. Can't find 10 people. And so the whole place was destroyed. You think about that. Patience and even the mercy of God. How many times had God grabbed you by the hand when you're lingering in places you had no business lingering or doing? And how many times has God warned you about consequences before those consequences came? How many times does God need to delay judgment before we finally turn to God? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just about wrath. It's a story about God who warns, who waits, who listens, and then who rescues. Well, the third part, the danger of compromise. There's a tragic figure in this story besides the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that is Lot. Lot is called righteous in the New Testament, but he chose to live in Sodom. After Abraham and Lot left on the way to the Promised Land, Lot moved to Sodom. In chapter 13 of Genesis, he pitched his tent there. Later on, he's described as sitting by the city gate. Lot didn't start in the middle of corruption. He lived into it slowly and gradually. First he looked at it, then he drew near, then he lived in it, then he led within it. He lived by the city gate. Compromise in our lives, like it happened with Lot, does not always happen overnight. Sometimes it comes with all kinds of slow steps like Lot took. Lot was saved. I mean, he got out of Sodom and Gomorrah, but he almost lost everything. He lost his home, he lost his influence, he lost his wife when she looked back, and he lost his testimony about the grace of God in their lives. It is sometimes tempting to live close to Sodom like Lot did. On the other hand, we're called to live in the world but not be of it. We're called to be shining lights in a dark world, not blend into a dark world. The story warns against drift, kind of leaning toward Sodom, leaning toward all kinds of things that they were doing there. Not the sin of homosexuality, but rather the sin of arrogance, injustice, pride, excess. All of those things are what we're called to move against. So the last thing, after the seriousness of it, is that the tragedy of looking back. Lot and his family fled. They were given one command as they left Sodom: don't look back. Don't look back on the stuff that you left behind you. But Lot's wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. Her heart, maybe, was still in Sodom. Her feet were leaving, but her affections were still there. In a sense, you can't walk forward with footsteps toward God while clinging to yesterday's sin. Some people want deliverance without separation. They want salvation without surrender. They want heaven without letting go. But following God involves trust. It requires forward movement. God said to Abraham, go. God can't steer a parked car. So you have to go. You have to move. You have to make progress. You can't be a lazy boy Christian. So I think part of what that means for us today is that we just need to examine our hearts, our head, our hearts, our hands. We need to examine our hearts and make sure that there are things we don't compromise. Sometimes we think a little white lie is not that bad. Well, little white lies lead to greater white lies and leads to further compromise on our convictions. It all calls us to come when God calls. God is urging you to leave things behind and not linger and move forward with God. So Abraham and Lot got out of Sodom, but the smoke of the city that was arising after the destruction is not the end of God's story, because we're reminded that sin is serious. Mercy is available. We're also reminded that intercession matters. Abraham went to God and said, God, I love how he says, far be it from you. God, you can't do such a thing. Intercession with God matters. It tells us that compromise is dangerous, and it reminds us that rescue is always possible. God calls us to be rescued, to live a more righteous and faithful life with our head, heart, and hands. Remember, Romans, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you might know what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Remember that important Bible verse today. I look forward to being with you for episode 16, and until then, continue to make it a great day. See you soon.